All right, let's get started. So the shaila is, okay, so let's start a new issue. Um, we learned yesterday that when refunding a customer for a mekach tos, for a transaction that was done under false pretenses because the merchandise is defective or for some other reason, the merchant has to give back cash. The only time the merchant does not have to give back cash is if he doesn't have cash. And if it comes to legal litigation, he'll have to be able to prove to the court that indeed he doesn't have the cash. Okay, let's go on to the next. She'ela, Misha Kvana Shakana Kvar Mechanut Plonit, V'achar kach nitbarer shahamocher mochar biyoker. Someone who has purchased from a certain store, and then it became clear that the seller is selling at inflated prices. Ha'im muter l'saper l'lokeach shemocher ze mocher lo yoter biyoker, o yesh iser l'saper l'koine. So, is it permissible to tell another buyer that this seller is ripping people off? Or is it usher to tell that to another buyer? Okay, so the answer is, like, as far as disclosing information about a guy who's selling goods that are inflated, their prices. Im hamocher mocher lelokech biyoker, v'hatosefet hi pachot mishishit. If a seller sells items at an inflated price, and it's not ona'ah because it's less than, a sixth, Eno chayev lahachzer klum. The seller does not have to offer a refund. Kevin shebepachot mishishit regilam limchal, as we learned before in the laws of ona'ah. People are generally will be moichel, will forego trying to go after someone for overcharging them for a small margin. V'lochein asur l'saper lakona shemacher lo yoter biyoker va'av shelo yihi hefsid mamon. So if a person has already purchased an item from that buyer, you're not allowed to inform him if it was a one-time purchase. So what he's talking about is a guy who bought already. Can you tell him you got ripped off from this guy? If it's not actionable, then you're not allowed to tell him. Nimsa she'ein to'elas lakona b'mesh yisaper lo over bazel iser. He says it will turn out that if you end up telling a buyer who's already made the purchase that there's no to'elas, there's no benefit, and it's just an iser rechilus, you're creating unnecessary enmity through this lashon hara. So obviously this has to be qualified. The question is, what kind of merchandise is the buyer purchasing? He already stated that this guy has already made the purchase. But what if the guy's a habitual customer? If he's a habitual customer, then there's nothing wrong. So he refers us in the footnote to the Chafetz Chaim and Hilchos Rechilus. It might just be worth just a glimpse at the Chafetz Chaim for just a minute, just to be able to appreciate this halacha. Hopefully I have it on my CD. Just give it a sec. And I want us to really look for a moment at this halacha and really try to understand it. Okay. So I'm just bringing it up. It'll just take a moment.
So let me be clear, if the person already bought it, you can't say something because it's ridiculous.
But only if it's not actionable, right? If it's not actionable, right? Like, so for example, he got ripped off, but not to the point where you could take him to a beis din.
Right.
The guy charged an additional 15% for on a commodity that you could get anywhere else for less money. So there's no benefit in telling the buyer that he got ripped off. But if you feel that the guy is going to be a repeat customer, let's say it's a grocery store, then you can tell the guy, you
Right
know,
down the street is cheaper over there, this guy's more expensive.
right.
15% or 6%?
1/6
One
is
sixth.
is 16 2/3%. So
But if he hasn't gone to that store yet, if he just asked you, listen, I need to get this, you know, what do you suggest before I go buy it? Should I go to Han Yankel? And he says, no, I know that he's more expensive, even though he's underneath the Ona, the 1/60, the 1/6. Are you allowed to say something to him? At that point, is it considered
yeah,
dishonest?
no, if he's asking you your opinion and he wants to know your opinion is where he should go, so then there's nothing wrong with telling him, there's some people
Oh,
who
and it's
charge
cheaper, and
more.
so.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Exactly. Yeah,
So it's after the fact is really what the shaila is, if you're gonna accomplish anything.
right. This is only when it's after the fact. Let me just see okay, I've got something running in the background that I got to close because it's slowing my system down. Okay, so I close that. Does this help the situation at all? No. For something's running in the background of my computer that's making it a little bit difficult for this thing to come up. So
Rabbi, you should know that in secular law, the risk of defaming somebody's personal, reputation or even his goods is that it can be actionable itself. So that if you tell somebody, you got ripped off or something, or his goods are no good, they're garbage or whatever, somebody might sue. You could sue for the affected person could sue for defamation in secular court, either libel if it's in writing or slander if it's orally stated. And if there's no defense, like the truth or anything like that, you could be liable, especially if it's on the internet, for big damages.
yeah, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. I believe that's the case, and probably in the U.S. and in Israel as well, that a person can be sued for defamation. Um, yeah.
Is there a difference in law between libel and slander? Or is there even a difference?
I believe that libel is usually verbal and slander is in print. So I don't think there's any distinction in halacha between the two. Lashon hara can be in multiple forms, and it's always going to be aser. All right. So for some reason, I'm not able to bring up that program. We'll try to bring something for you tomorrow. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. I don't know what happened there. Okay, let us go on. Mekachtos bekona machal mekulkul v'sha etzlo kama yamim. Okay, a person makes a purchase of food that turned out to be bad. This happens all the time. You buy something, you open it up, and it's got mold, but then there's more details here. Misha kana machal mesuyim v'nimsabo rikavono toloim. Let's say a person buys a certain food and discovers that it started to rot, it started to go bad or get wormy. The thing is that it's now been with you for a few days, and now you want to return it to the merchant. And the seller says, why did you wait 5 days before bringing it back? You should have brought it back right away. So the question is, can the seller refuse to take it back halachically based on the fact that the guy waited for a few days? In other words, when a person makes a mekach tos, he purchases something that turns out to be bad. Is there a time limit in which he has to return the item? Or is he allowed to wait a few days? So the response is Misha kana machal mesuyim v'nimser shu mekulkal im ze machmas rikavon v'ifush o sheyesh ba'otu machal tolaim. So in this case, where the food has gone bad even before I opened it up, im machziro l'mocher miyad kishenimser rikavon harei zamum u'machzir hadomim l'lokeach. So obviously, no merchant can say, sorry, I sold it as is, you've got to take the goods. There, that's a bona fide mekachtos, and if you bring it back right away, he's got to give you your money back. Vim oto ma'achal shaha kama yamim etzel hakone, yish ishlo lemumchim im yarmru delefi godol harikavon mucho sheitchil akilkul od kishaya biyad hamocher. He says, if it's been in the buyer's possession for a few days, however, so then you have to consult with experts. In other words, let's say the buyer says, oh, as soon as I opened it up, I could tell that it smelled bad, right? And he brings it back a week later. Well, the seller can say, well, maybe it's because you held on to it for a week, that it went bad. Maybe it was fine when you bought it. So this is part of the challenge. I mean, a seller does have a right to say, you bought this a week ago. Well, of course, it's cottage cheese. And if you bought it a week ago, it's not unusual for it to start to go bad.
Yeah, but the other side of that is that if you buy your cottage cheese, I was just thinking of the thing before you mentioned cottage cheese, because you buy, let's say, two of them, and the expiry date says you have 6 weeks, and you don't open it for 2 weeks later until after you bought it, and then you open it up and you see it's all molded.
Right. So it'll all depend on the expiry date. Right.
Then you still have a time period though. You can still go to the store and say, look, I still expiry date.
Exactly. I just opened this
Yeah,
up.
yeah.
Yeah, but then you can say, oh, did you leave it in the backyard or you left it outside for like, this is how do you fruit?
He says, if if the amount of rot or mold that is on the food item, it's possible or likely that the rot had already set in even before the guy made the purchase. Yesh lahachzir hamekach v'yitein hadam lokech. So then give the guy his money back. V'im yesh safek im harikavon ve'ifush hitchil etzel halokeach ein hamocher machzir lo damim. But if it's unclear, in other words, yes, obviously when an item is perishable, it's eventually going to go bad. But if it's been a week and it's possible that when you bought it, it was intact, it's possible that when you bought it, it had already started to go bad. So I, as a seller, hamotzi mechavero olav haraya, the burden of proof is on you. Prove to me that it was bad when you bought it. I don't have to take your word for it. Mishum sheyesh litlot shekil kol haperos hitchilu etzel halokeach, kevin shenimtzoim etzlo v'lochein hadin hu hamotzi mechavero olav lo havi raya. So he says, so that would be the argument. However, he says, v'yesh me'achronim shekasu shegam shekishnol arasofik birshus halokeach, im hakona lo nasan es hamos adayin lo natan et hamos l'mocher eno chayv litin mishum shahamutz mechaver olav haraya. What if the guy bought the food on credit and he hasn't paid for it yet? So in that situation, the tables are turned. And the buyer can say, well, I'm not paying you for this because hamotzi mechaver olav haraya. Now the burden of proof is on the seller to prove that the item had not started to go bad until it was in my possession. It's only if the seller already received the money that the onus is on the buyer. V'nira she'im hakoina bocher me'otam hayirakot v'aperot o hakitniot v'yachol lirot im heim neguim im lav okay shadvarm yeduim l'chol shemitzuyim bohem toloim utzrichim bedika hachrayas hirak al hakona ve'en kan bittul mekach. Now, what would be the halacha, however, if it's, let's say, the buyer is purchasing a type of vegetable and he brings it back to the store because the vegetable has bugs, okay?
From a halachic perspective?
No, he wants to return it because he's a frum yid and he knows he can't eat bugs. And he says, look, this broccoli is infested. Then
You shouldn't have bought the broccoli.
Oh, okay,
Exactly.
okay. So he says, "V'yochel lirot im heim neguim im lav." He says you can easily see whether there's infestation or not,
You should have blended it.
or if it's known to everyone, or if it's known to everyone that this item is very commonly an infested vegetable and they need to be checked, then it's the buyer's responsibility. In other words, when you buy something with full knowledge that there's a very good chance that this is going to be an infested item, then you can't nullify the sale
So like
afterwards.
dates, you always have to check when you open them up to make sure there's no bugs inside.
Unless they're pitted dates, a lot of,
Even pitted dates.
yeah.
You. Yeah, you can see,
I think it depends where they come from. But it could be, you're right, it could be you have to open up dates also.
Robin, but the reality of today is that customer or buyer retention is very important for businesses. So most sellers have an agreement with their suppliers, like anything wrong, I'm just taking the return, especially the big store. No question
It
about it.
depends
They
on the
have an
industry.
agreement with the Supplier.
Depends on the industry. I'll give you an example. I already told my wife, don't buy watermelons from No Frills. Don't buy watermelons from No Frills. The reason why you pay less for watermelons at No Frills is because about half of them are not really that good. Yeah, because there's different grades of melon, and so
it goes for everything.
yeah, but specifically like a good watermelon in the summer, you got to pay more if you want to get something that you're not going to have to worry, is it sweet or not, or is it mushy or not, or whatever. So No Frills has a policy that they will not take watermelons back.
Specifically developed.
Watermelons, yeah.
Is
Because
that ridiculous?
no, because it depends on the industry. So what we've learned bottom line is like this. While it's true that some stores will have a policy, no questions asked, if the customer wants his money back, we'll give the money back and we'll just eat the loss because there's so much waste in the food business to begin
They
with.
don't eat the supplier off makes the loss. Depends, right?
A lot of
90%
times.
of the time.
A lot.
Like Costco, they'll take stuff back, whatever it is, no questions asked, even past the warranty time.
Even
That's terrible.
half eaten, they also.
Yeah, it is terrible.
But does Costco eat the loss, or they?
Absolutely not. They ship it back to every vendor and they deduct it.
Real-
It
really?
can be past the time. If you don't like it, too bad. You have to make a decision.
Yeah.
And they let you know though. You'll know that when you sign the vendor agreement.
Mhm.
But food is different. It's not that the watermelon's not rotten. It's just, they're not great. You go to Sue's, you'll pay 3 times as much for a watermelon, but 99% of the time it's gonna be delicious.
Right.
But you're paying the difference.
Exactly.
So.
Is there a sign at No Frills for the watermelon?
I never heard of that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know if there's a sign. I have to double check my information with my shopping expert in the house. Okay, but
Interesting.
all of this makes sense. It makes logical sense from a halachic standpoint. If there's a dispute as to whether the item went bad in the possession of the seller versus the possession of the buyer, we generally say hamotzi mechavero olav haraya.
How do you prove that? That's just so difficult.
Well, one of the things you could do is you could look at the expiry date. If the person bought the item and it was on the shelves past the expiry date.
That's a no-brainer.
So then
Again, like with the example we used with the cheese that has a longer extension, but they can come back to the store. What happened if by accident you left it in your car for 4 days before you missed to take it in, then you brought it in, and you opened it up a week later, and it's all
it's all green. Yeah.
right, because you left it in the car. So how do you have much of a chavera over?
They don't ask that question. I never had that problem.
Well, if you come back, you bring the bill, you brought it back 2 weeks later, even though the expiry date is supposed to be still good for another 2 weeks. Obviously, when it comes to something that's $5, I don't
Yeah,
think
the
no one's going to
numbers
base it. I think this is about the principle of it,
Yeah.
of how do you deal with, when you go to a store. Because that's what we're talking about here. Is really.
Rabbi, one of the things you can do, especially in secular law, is take a photograph of it immediately with a date stamp.
Right,
Yeah, that's
right,
something.
right. But most people don't think of doing that when they come home from the grocer. They're not going to start taking photos of their food. Yeah. So the source for this actually is a Chuvas Harash that he quotes in the footnote, where he has the following case. The Rush, as you know, is a Rishon. He lives in the 14th century. Ruvain shemocher l'shimon gevinos. Ruvain is selling wheels of cheese. Cheese was a big commodity going back centuries. Ula'acher gimel yamim pascham umatzom merukavos rikavan gadol. After 3 days of having them in his possession, Shimon rather opens up one of the cheeses and discovers that it's really rotted through. Veheshiv sheyesh lishol la'osei gevinos bekamazman roi lovo rikavan v'ifush. So the Rush said, ask the experts, how many days does it take for a wheel of cheese to come to that level of rotting? Okay. Im yomer shenasu harikavan b'vei samocher nimtzo shaya mekaftos. He says, so in the event that the experts can tell you that takes a couple of weeks and you've only had it for 3 days, so it was already starting to rot when it was in the possession of the seller. So like there's a whole science to making cheese that you can preserve for a really long time. Back in those days, there was no refrigeration, so they would store hard cheese in the cellar, and there was a whole science to it. V'im hadavar safek hamotze mechavero levaray, and if it's unclear whether the rotting took place in the possession of the seller or the buyer, then whoever is holding the cash is the one who has the advantage, and the other party has to bring proof. Yeah. Okay.
That's interesting because you had no refrigeration. It's an interesting question. At that time. We once had those migdal cheeses, those 108 slices things.
Yeah.
We once left one by accident in the fridge in a cottage. And we came back the next summer and it was still fun.
Yeah, because
Because all the garbage.
that stuff glows in the dark.
It's just garbage of garbage. Fresher than ever.
Yeah, I'm sure if you put it out, the animals wouldn't need it. Okay. All right. Let's go on. She'ela, Misha kana zir onim b'miyuchad lizriya, v'cheshezoram ba'adama lo tzamchu. A guy purchases seeds for planting, goes to a nursery or just a regular store, and they're selling packets of seeds. And he plants them, and they don't grow. Ha'im yesh kan mekach tos v'chayv hamocher l'shalim lakonis kol ha'otzos she'otzi hakon el azriya. And the guy, bought a whole bunch of other stuff. He bought fertilizer. He bought, weed killer. He bought all of this, and he started. He bought tools to be able to hoe and do all the things he needed to do. And the seeds ended up being duds. So, what is the merchant's obligation who sold him the seeds? There was not just the cost of the seeds, but all of this ancillary expenditures that were made.
He's missed a growing season also. It's probably too late to plant the seeds by that point. Again, new seeds.
What do you mean?
Like, so you plant the seeds in early spring, and that's the best time to plant it. And then it's like 6 weeks later, 5 weeks later, there's nothing come up. So even you get good seeds afterwards, they missed the season.
He missed the season also. Are there any damages that he can take for that? Oh, shenomar shein hamocher chayv b'achrayas al shelo hotziu hazram samachim ve'en hamekach batel. Or can the seller say, look, man, I sold you seeds. They're just seeds. Maybe you just don't have a green thumb, and I don't have any liability at all. So what's the case over there? So tshuva, hamocher zir onei gina shemiyuchad, and this is, by the way, this is a case that you could definitely see being asked by the Gemara or by the by the Rishonim, because this is a very common case. So hamocher zir onei gina shemiyuchadim lezir v'lo tzamchu machmas atzman chayev ba'achriyusan. So if a guy sells seeds and they don't grow, and the buyer did everything that he needed to do in order to cultivate them. In other words, there was no error in the way that he planted them, so then the seller is liable. He says this is true even though the seller can't get back his seeds. In other words, by the very definition, once you've planted seeds, you're done. You can't start plucking them from the ground and getting them back. So, and then, so what is the seller's liability? The cost of the seeds. He says, but the seller is not going to be liable for all of the other ancillary costs, because that's really just a grumma. It's causative damage. Like, I sold you seeds. You decided to make all of these other purchases to help the seeds grow. That's not my problem. And the same thing will be true for any time a sale is made, a transaction is made, where the buyer acted responsibly in trying to use this object. Okay, you can just imagine a guy goes to IKEA and buys a piece of furniture that he's got to put together, and he gets and it says, insert this and that, and he's not able to insert part A into hole B. And so he pushes and he shtups, and finally he takes a hammer and starts banging the thing, and then the whole thing shatters. So, and then he's so frustrated, you can imagine that frustration. So he goes back to IKEA and they say to him, well, did you follow the instructions? I thought I did. And then he shows them what he did, and they can say to him, sorry, sir, you were looking at the thing upside down, or you had the wrong piece. The part A wasn't supposed to go into hole B. It was supposed to go into hole C, and hole C is the much bigger hole. So there's a situation where the seller can argue, if you mishandled the merchandise, or you didn't do the responsible thing when you tried to use it in its proper use, so then we're not responsible. Okay, so I want to continue this in Mirz Hashem tomorrow.
So IKEA puts a rule on that, they're not responsible.
Well, IKEA will only be responsible if when you open the package, there's a part that's broken. But if everything is intact and you ended up breaking it because you got so frustrated that you threw it against the wall, and then it breaks, so they're not going to be responsible.
That's what it is.
Yeah.